patience is one of these things that if we're honest with ourselves, we know we all need to work on it. And most people I know are too afraid to ask God to help them with patience. As I hear at least one person chuckling. There's a reason why you don't ask God to help you with patience, because it is at least the superstitious belief that if you ask God for patience, then he will put you in trying circumstances to test your patience. And so, we are impatient creatures, though, especially collectively, and this days it even seems more so. We have a world that is driven by instant information and instant gratification. When an event happens, the media flock to all the talking heads and the leaders and the celebrities and demand an instant word, tell us now. And if you pause, delaying, people begin to put words in your mouth even. We are such an impatient people that if you say, hold on a minute, I need to think about this, or hold on, let me get more information, people start to come to judgments. And so we know in ourselves, if we're honest, that we are impatient people. If we're honest with ourselves, we know that we all tend more towards Veruca Salt than Charlie Bucket. That's a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory reference for those people. Veruca Salt is a little girl who says, I want it now. We all know that deep down inside, that's who we are. We fight with that. And throughout James's letter, he's been challenging us and instructing us on what it looks like to have a genuine living faith, showing us what true saving faith in Jesus looks like, lived out in the world. And he continues that in these verses that we're going to look at this morning, carrying on the theme that he laid out that we looked at last week in verses 13 through 17, as he encouraged us to think eternally with our relationship with God as our sovereign, encouraging us, don't make plans, but rather submit to the Lord who's in charge. Live with him as your Lord. Live with him at the forefront. Don't be arrogant, but submit in humility to the Lord. He continues that theme now as he starts with these similar words as he started them, where he said before in verse 13, come now, you who would make plans, you who would do these things. Now he says, come now, again, and we'll read there as we go to James chapter 5, starting in verse 1. The center of this passage is patience. As we read it, you'll hear the word patience shows up at least 3 different times. We're called to patience. And so James chapter 5, starting in verse 1, we read there, come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of your laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, look to the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. And so this passage seems to take a pretty hard turn in the middle there, doesn't it? It starts off with this, come now, weep and mourn, howl. We're like, Pastor, you said this was about patience. What are we talking about? Well, he introduces this concept of patience by first starting with something that doesn't seem like it connects to patience, but it does, and I'll show you how it does. he starts by this condemnation of wealth, and he goes back to this language, like I said, of 4:13. Come on now. In verse 13, he said, come on now, you who make plans and say such and such is going to happen. Submit to the Lord. Let him direct your ways, and say if the Lord wills. But the Lord's will, understand that the Lord's will might be different than yours. And now he comes with this scathing condemnation. He echoes Isaiah in Isaiah 13:6, where he's, wail, for the day of the Lord is at hand. As destruction from the Almighty it will come. And he seems to target the wealthy. And as we talk about the wealthy, it's important to note two big things. One, being wealthy is not a sin. Joseph of Arimathea was wealthy, who gave his tomb to Jesus. From the Old Testament, Abraham, David, Solomon, great men of the faith who were wealthy. In the New Testament, we have people who are wealthy as well. So being wealthy in and of itself is not a sin. But also, the second thing when we consider wealth is that if you're hearing my voice, and I say this because people watch online, and this gets recorded and put on YouTube, if you can hear my voice, either in this building or online now or online at some later point, you are in the top 1% of the 1% of all people who have ever lived in terms of wealth. We sit in a room where we complain of it being hot outside, and we come into the air conditioning. Most of you, I'm pretty sure, woke up in a house where you could, if you so desired, go over to a faucet and get at least cool and refreshing water out of a faucet and drink it without concern of parasites or bacteria. This puts us in such a privileged place that when we think about what the Bible is calling out the wealthy, even if we are not wealthy by today's standards, we are wealthy in historical standards. We are wealthy compared to most people on earth today, never mind all people who have ever lived throughout all of history. We are extraordinarily wealthy and blessed. And so when we hear this talk of wealth, we have a tendency, well, I'm not wealthy, that's talking about somebody else. From James' perspective, you have more than he could imagine. And we often hear it said that money is the root of all evil. And that's why we think of this, when it talks about wealth, we get a little defensive of this. But it's important to note that Paul says in 1 Timothy 6:10 that it is not money that is the root of all evil, but it is the love of money that is the roots of all kinds of evil, it says. So it's not that money itself is somehow tainted and dirty and bad. It is, in fact, just the love of money that drives us to evil. And James's purpose here is not primarily to teach the ungodly who are rich about the error of their ways, because he pulls upon himself the mantle like an Old Testament prophet, like Isaiah, who Isaiah, if you read in Isaiah, he cries out against these foreign nations. He cries out against Babylon and against Syria and against Moab and against all these other nations. And it's not that these people were ever going to see a copy of Isaiah, but rather the point was that God's people needed to know what God thought of these people. That hearing these oracles, they would show God's people why they were neither to fear nor copy those people. And when it comes to the wealthy, when it comes to those who pursue worldly wealth, in this letter he has laid out this difference between the ways of the world and the ways of following Christ. And there's a temptation there to say, well, you know, it would just be so much easier in so many ways to just forget all this Jesus stuff and then just go live my life how I want. They have stuff. They have money. They can pursue all this. And so James steps in and says, hold on a second. And he cries out against those who are wealthy. It's a warning to not head in that direction. Don't just indulge in wealth. And he charges them of several different things here. He charges them of hoarding. In verses 2 through 3, he paints this picture of lavish treasure going to waste, telling them of their food rotting, their garments moth-eaten, their gold and silver corroded, each one coming to nothing in its own way. Before modern banking, wealth was not a matter of money in a bank, but it was a matter of commodities. Things like grain and clothing and precious metals were common ways of storing wealth. And James says each one of those things will rot. Your grain will go moldy eventually. It will rot. Your clothing will deteriorate with moths. We don't really worry about moths nowadays, but once upon a time, things like mothballs were fairly common because moths were a big problem. If you had, most of our clothing has so many artificial material in it, it's not a problem. But back when clothing was wool and cotton almost entirely, it was an issue. And so we look to these items, how they will rot. And he goes on to say gold and silver. Well, we know gold and silver don't rot. They don't corrode. That's in fact one of the reasons why they are precious metals, because gold will not rot. Silver will not rust. So what is he talking about here? Well, he's talking about them being tarnished. Because he's going to go on to talk about how their tarnish and their corrosion testifies against them, that they've been hoarding this wealth, and it is sitting there, unused, just sitting, being tarnished from disuse, not being used. And he goes on to say that the tarnish, the corrosion on that precious metal will testify against them, that they have hoarded it, that they have set it aside and they haven't done anything with it. Because they should not have done that. They are supposed to give to the poor. They're supposed to live generously. Wealth is a tool to be used, not to be hoarded. Throughout the law, they're told to love their neighbors as themselves, to give generously. Leviticus 25:35 says that if your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him. You shall support him. He shall live with you. You shall not lend him your money with interest, nor give him the food for profit. You should give to him generously. That's what we are supposed to do with our wealth. Wealth is not some bad thing. Money isn't a bad thing. Money is a tool to be used for the benefit of ourselves and those around us. That's why the idea of hoarding it and just setting it aside over there to rot and corrupt and to tarnish is so chided against here. It is something that should be used for God's glory, not to just be held aside. He charges them in verse 5 with extravagance, not only just stockpiling, hoarding this wealth, but fattening themselves up, with language that reminded me of Ezekiel 34 with the false shepherds that Jesus cries out against when he says he's the good shepherd. In Ezekiel 34:3, the Lord rebukes those false shepherds, and he tells them that you eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wolves, you slaughter the fat ones, but you don't feed the sheep. So he charges them here, these specifically wealthy people that are living in extravagance with their ungodly attitude, seeing themselves at the center of everything and indulging themselves, not seeing the needs of others around them. They are fattening themselves, but they're not seeing the needs of anybody else. They're being selfish. They're hoarding their wealth. They're being selfish. And we can see that as he charges them in verse 4 with injustice. He says, you're not being just. You are not supposed to do this. You are not being fair. You are keeping people's wages. You are being a cheat. You are being unrighteous. And again, not that wealth is unjust, but it's easy for us with all of our stuff, and I say us, all of us, the top 1% of the 1% of people who have ever lived on earth, it's easy for us to get distracted by our stuff. And in getting distracted by our stuff, we lose focus of the things that really matter. We focus on us, what we want, what we need. We fail to see how us focusing on our needs and our hurts, we are missing the cares and the needs of others around us. So much so that maybe we're even shorting people. But James makes it clear that no injustice gets past, as he calls him here, the Lord of hosts, Yahweh Sabaoth. This is an Old Testament term, the Lord of armies, the Lord who brings his justice. That is the image that he uses here. It's a title for God that only appears here in one other place in the New Testament. This idea of God of armies, who comes as judge and conqueror to make all things right. James says, if you are treating people unjustly, you will not escape. And so, like I said at the beginning here, this is about patience. And we might say, what? Because it doesn't seem like patience. Pastor, I think you're losing your mind. But all this wealth is tied to impatience and to the self-governing of 4:13 through 17 that we looked at last week. Hoarding, storing up things to the point of living overly luxurious lives to the lack of others and showing them injustice is centered on impatience. Because ultimately, at the end of it all those things, hoarding of wealth and doing these things, is about control. It's about taking control of things both now and tomorrow. I will be in control of my today, and I will store this stuff for my tomorrow. I will not be patient and wait. It is about holding and possessing all that we can because we're afraid of what might come later. We're afraid of what we might not be able to do later. And so we hoard these things because we're afraid. We hoard these things because we are impatient. We don't have the patience to look to tomorrow for what the Lord might do. We don't think of eternity. In our Sunday school class, we were talking about how it's so hard for us as humans to hold eternity in our hearts and minds. We are such time-bound creatures. Everything about our lives is time. Right now, you might be thinking of time. Earlier today, if you were cooking, or last night as you were preparing for whatever you brought for potluck, you were thinking about time. How long is it going to be in the oven? Every single thing of our lives is bound by time. So much so that we have a hard time thinking of anything beyond time. And yet God is beyond time. And he offers us eternal life beyond time. And so what do we do with that? We find ourselves afraid. And so we kind of shunt off that part and don't think about eternity. But we're supposed to think about eternity. And if we think about eternity, all this talk of wealth and stuff, it works itself out if we're thinking eternally minded. And so it might seem disconnected, but we know it's connected because right in this very chapter, he calls to us out of this talk, and he says in verse 7, therefore, be patient. So wealth, condemnation, wealth, all this stuff. And then he says, therefore, well, what's the therefore? Therefore. It's tying this language of wealth to this patience. So this crying against wealth, this exhortation to not be focused on the things of this world. And he says, therefore, be patient. Be patient. Wealth is something that distracts us, which is why one of my favorite verses, and I mentioned it in there, so for those of you in Sunday school and I couldn't remember the verse, Proverbs 30, verses 8 through 9 says, remove far from me falsehood and lying. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is needful for me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. Balance is what he's talking about. Having an eternal mindset. Because he calls us to a prophetic patience. In verses 7 through 11, as he hinged this verse, weep and mourn, you wealthy. Be patient. Have patience. Think of eternity. Not just in matters of the wealth, but in trying to plan. Verses 4:13 through 17, again, follows into this, where he cries out there, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will do such and such a thing. All you who boast such way are arrogant. And so he says, come now, you wealthy. And now he says, be patient. Don't be so concerned about tomorrow. Don't be concerned about wealth. Don't be concerned about these things. Don't be concerned of the injustice of the wealthy either. As he says in verse 7, therefore be patient, my brothers, until the coming of the Lord. Be patient. And it's interesting that as he cries out the wealthy and he says, weep and mourn, you wealthy. And now he says, brothers and sisters, be patient. Look to the coming of the Lord. Have eternity in mind, because that's how we can have patience. This is not just patience for the sake of patience. This is patience that's focused on a specific thing, the coming of the Lord. That's why when we joked earlier about praying for patience and we're afraid that God's going to give us all these things to test our patience, James says, be patient. Look to the coming of the Lord. Because patience for the sake of patience, with no end in sight, that's the hard thing. And it's actually impossible to wrap our head around. But he says, don't just be patient with no end sight, with no goal in sight. But he says, be patient for a particular and defined period of time, and for a particular and defined purpose, the coming of the Lord. Be patient, not in just a generic sense. Just like faith is not, we don't have faith in faith, we have faith in the Lord. He's saying, be patient in the Lord. And he turns us to the illustration of a farmer. And there is perhaps not a more perfect illustration for our community than this. Because we all, if we're not a farmer, we all know someone who is. If you don't know somebody who is, there's several in this room. Join us for our lunch afterwards and you can talk to some of them. But he points to the farmer and he says to them, the one who is the farmer, he has to plant and he has to wait. Farmers have to be patient. You put the seed in the ground and you can't do anything but wait. I mean, you can fertilize, you can water, you can do all that, but what do you have to do? You have to sit and wait. There's nothing else to do. And so he says, be like that farmer. And look to the ground, knowing that eventually, someday, a plant's going to spring up. And then you see with the corn, I mean, it springs up and it's like this, and then the next day it's like this, and the next day it's like that. And even with that, you have the stalk, and then you start to see the ears. And I know when I first came here, I started seeing ears on the corn, and even as they start to turn brown, I'm like, are they ever going to harvest it? Are they ever going to harvest it? Are they ever going to harvest it? When are they going to harvest it? I didn't know how these things worked. I'm the newcomer into town. And so I had to have patience. Oh, are they ever going to, when do these people ever harvest their corn? In the ancient Near East, the harvest was dependent upon seasonal rain. They had the early rain and the latter rain. They had these two rains. You had to wait for this latter rain to bring the harvest to its full ripeness. It's a desert. You would plant it. There'd be the early rains that would come, and it would give the plants enough to sprout and to come forth. But without those latter rains, without those second rains to come, the plants would never come to full ripeness. So the farmer had to wait. And ultimately to trust in the Lord. Deuteronomy 11:14-15 tells the people of Israel that he, the Lord, will give the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil. And he will give grass to your fields for your livestock, and you shall eat and be full. This is a matter of faith. To put the seed into the ground and trust that the Lord was going to bring the rains. So much of the idolatry of the nations around Israel was centered on this, because they tried to take control of this process. If I go to Baal, I can give such and such a sacrifice, and Baal is the god of the rains, and he will bring the rains in season. I will take control of this thing. Whereas the Lord says, you can't control it. You have to have faith and patience in me. He's appealing to us to trust in God, not just nature, but trust in God, in his faithfulness, and in his goodness. He's calling to us to have a patience that extends beyond just even this part of our life, but to all of our life, including and up to how we treat others, by calling us in verse 9 to telling us how we treat other people. Do not judge others, because the Lord will take care of it. Be patient. You don't have to judge other people, because the Lord will take care of it. We're so often blinded by this that we miss this point, and we think we all have to do it now. If I don't yell at this person now, well, then no one will know. I encounter that with my children. One of my children punches one of the other kids, and we say, "What did you do?" Well, he did this. Well, why didn't you come and tell me? Because they're impatient. They want to do it right now. Justice must be enacted now. Sometimes we're even sitting at the table and someone does something, and before I even have a chance to say something about it, they are acting and trying to bring about justice in their own way. And we say, you have to trust in Mama and Daddy. You have to trust in us that we've got it. And so James says the same thing. Trust in the Lord. Don't judge other people. Don't condemn them. Let them be in the Lord's hands. The Lord will take care of it. Be patient. He exhorts us to look at the prophets. As he himself took on the mantle of prophet by saying, woe to these people, he says, now look to the prophets and consider their patience. Consider how the Lord worked in them. To pick just one, for example, Jeremiah, who his own family betrayed him. And at Jeremiah 12:6, he was beaten and put in stocks by the temple officials, chapter 20. He was imprisoned by the king in chapter 37. He was threatened with death in chapter 38. He was thrown into a cistern also in chapter 38. Jeremiah had his rough times. And that's just one of the prophets. Not to mention so many thousands of prophets that are named who risked their lives to bring the word of the Lord to the people. Their steadfast faith, the patience, and their faith in the Lord was centered on who God is and trusting God in his righteousness and his judgment. And we get from James the only New Testament reference to Job right after that. The only New Testament reference to Job. Job has become a proverb. James uses him as a proverb. He says, consider Job and his patience. The patience of Job we see as in the middle of his suffering. Job 1:21, he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I would say, well, that's easy then. But even in the midst of it all, even after he loses all of his stuff, and after his friends come and chastise him up and down, and he has nowhere to turn, he says in Job 19:25, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. After my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. He says, his heart fainted within him at such a thought. Though my flesh be destroyed, I will see the Lord. I know that my Redeemer lives. This is the patience of Job. That even in the midst of all that he had, and all that he was going through, he was patient and he trusted in the Lord. And he goes on to tell us in James here to consider the purposes of the Lord. And this ties, as we're approaching the end of James, this ties to the beginning of James, in James chapter 1, where he told us in James chapter 1 to consider it all joy when you go through hardships, because of the purpose of the Lord in those hardships. What was the purpose? To draw us closer to the Lord. That the Lord is using the things that we're going through in this life to draw us closer to himself. And now he brings it full circle to say, be patient and consider the purposes of the Lord. You have seen the purpose of the Lord, his compassion and his mercy. So consider it joy. No matter what we're going through, be patient and trust in the Lord. Be patient. He's got it. We don't have to amass wealth. He's got it. We don't have to enact justice. He's got it. We don't have to worry about tomorrow. He's got it. He calls us to foster this divine patience. And again, it's not just generic patience, but it's eternity-minded patience. To be patient because of what the Lord has done. 1 Peter 1:3-5 calls to us and says, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to his great mercy, who has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable. That wealth, right? Undefiled and unfading. Not the wealth of this earth, not that stuff, but an imperishable, undefiled, and unfading inheritance which has been kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. You have an inheritance in Christ that is so far beyond anything you can conceive of in this world. Be patient. Don't worry. Trust in the Lord. James's words call us to this, to live patiently, to focus on eternity in our lives. We see things in the news. Don't worry about it. Be patient. We see inflation and gas prices. Don't worry about it. Be patient. This outlook carries to our stuff, how we use it, how we get it, how we live. We're called to be, the Lord is faithful. He sent his Son into the world to save us. We can trust him to fulfill his word. And in trusting him, we can have true and lasting patience. Join me as we close in prayer.